In one of Brandon Sanderson's lectures on writing, he told this story. While he was writing one of his books, he began to adore one of his side characters more than the main character. They were much more interesting and had a far more fascinating arc and journey throughout the story than compared to the main character. But the side character was not the main character of the story. The main character was the main character of the narrative. So what did Brandon Sanderson do? Well, Brandon said, what if we just make our side character the main character and fix all of the problems? So that's exactly what he did. He rewrote the entire novel focusing on this side character, making them the main character of the story and thus strengthening the overall narrative. Now, why did Brandon Sanderson make this change? Simply put, because he wanted to. Not only would it be far more interesting for him to write that side character as the main character, it would also be far more captivating for the audience to read about a character that Brandon Sanderson genuinely adores. In addition to that, Brandon Sanderson would no longer feel like he has to stretch the narrative and pacing between the main character and that side character so that he could tell the story that he actually wants to tell. After the final episode of the Amazing Digital Circus was released about 2 months ago, there has been an uproar on the internet dissecting the problems with that last episode. Everything from Kane coming back from the dead to unanswered questions about the world to general problems with the pacing of the story. However, one of the biggest or perhaps loudest issues people had was with how much of the episode was focused on Jax. Now, Jax was not the main character of the Amazing Digital Circus. Yes, he did play a fairly big role throughout the series, but up until episode 5, he had just as much, if not less, screen time than Ragatha. Yet, as the series went on, Jax became a bigger and bigger player to the point that nearly half of the finale was dedicated solely to him. Now, that in and of itself is not a narrative breaking problem, but it does start to become a much bigger issue when you track the promises Gooseworks, the creator of the show, made about their story. Within stories themselves, plot can be divided into 3 different sections: promises, progress, and payoff. At the beginning of a narrative, a writer will promise certain things about their story. Ocean is going to pull off a big heist. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are going to end up together. Luke is going to become a Jedi. Then, as your story goes along, the writer will make progress on these promises. Ocean gets his crew together, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy spend time together and argue and fight, and Luke trains using a lightsaber with the Force. Finally, the story will end by paying off the promises made at the beginning. Ocean pulls off the heist. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy get married. Luke blows up the Death Star through the power of the Force. This is the basic overview of how to write plot. Now, there are certain stories that will pay off their promises in less straightforward ways. La La Land famously ended with the main couple not actually getting together, but this payoff works because the filmmakers actually made promises about these characters fulfilling their dreams, subverting the expectations of the audience who were used to a classic romance story. Another great example is Inception, where Christopher Nolan promises that Cobb is going to make it back to his family. But does he? You know, it was very unclear. However, this works because of the fascinating directions the progress made throughout the middle of the story, showing how tortured Cobb was by his own memories, leading to an ending where it didn't actually matter if this was real or not. Cobb actually chose to live his life. Basically, in order to write an effective plot, the writer will make promises about their story, then take those promises in interesting directions before paying off those promises in some satisfying, interesting, or thoughtful way. The reason why I wanted to go over this principle real quick is to show that all of this has to be done very intentionally. You as a storyteller must have a very good grasp on what promises you are making at the beginning of your story and how you will develop and pay them off in the end. Now, the execution of this principle can look different depending on your style of writing, but it is an essential piece of storytelling that will matter regardless of the way you tell stories. Now, what did all of that have to do with the Amazing Digital Circus? Well, I am not going to stand here and say that Gooseworks does not understand the most basic principle of plot. Gooseworks absolutely knows this. You can tell from the way that they wrote the last episode, they were trying to pay off as many of the promises they made as they possibly could. No, the issue with the finale feeling really rushed on some parts and very confusing on others, I think has more to do with the promises Gooseworks made both within and without the story itself. Essentially, Gooseworks promised to do far too many things with the Amazing Digital Circus than they actually wanted to do, distracting their focus from the story that they clearly desperately needed to tell. In order to properly make this video, I rewatched the entire series and took extensive notes on the promises Gooseworks made throughout each episode. For the first 4 episodes, Gooseworks is telling a story that promises a number of things. First, it promises that Pomni, and by extension the audience, is going to learn more about the CNA company and the digital circus itself. This is because of some certain filmmaking choices with the camera and with some odd moments in the pilot clearly leading the audience in that direction. Second, while escape may or may not be possible, Pomni is going to do something something that will really shake up the status quo of the circus, probably because of her empathetic personality. The way that she treats the NPCs, her connection to Kinger, as well as her helping Gangle in episode 4 really suggests that Pomni's empathy is what sets her apart from the rest of the cast. Finally, there is a strong developing thematic idea that is centered around the question of what will it take to survive a situation that feels impossible. The pilot starts us off with that question. Episode 2 evolves that question and provides a suitable answer in connecting with others. Episode 3 then adds a piece of substance onto that theme with the line of the worst thing you can do is to make someone feel unwanted, and episode 4 gives us Pomni attempting to help Gangle in ways that worked before until she had to try something different and practically carried a part of Gangle's burden onto herself. Then we get to episode 5, which really shook up the direction of the rest of the series. While the plot of Kane's Descent was still chugging along, Pomni and the thematic ideas promised in the first 4 episodes suddenly shifts, in some cases quite dramatically. Episode 5 really does its best to, honestly out of nowhere, force Pomni and Jax into a duo dynamic, and at certain parts it comes across as pretty unnatural. Take these 2 moments for instance, happening less than 5 minutes apart from each other.
Can you believe this, Pomni? First she draws anime, now she drags us all into one? She must be one of them, losers.
You threw me out of a moving truck.
Do you think Gangle is actually capable of being happy?
What?
I don't know, like her comedy mask still breaks every day. Does she think hanging out with Zubul is gonna magically fix that?
There was very little to build up this connection, and the audience gets blindsided by Jax and Pomni's new friendship, which is very different from the promise that we were going to see each of these characters thrive in their own connection to Pomni. At no point in the show is it ever suggested that we are going to get a main duo with Pomni and Jax until episode 5, which is far too late to establish a main character dynamic. Then Pomni has this conversation about showing your negative emotions, and that advice immediately backfires, which then has some wildly confusing implications for the theme of the story. As much genuine fun as this episode is, it is such an insane shift in promise from what the first 4 episodes set up that it is genuinely baffling to watch some of the storytelling decisions made here. Now, Gooseworks has gone on record to debunk episode's 5 huge change being driven by fan love for Jax, and honestly, I really believe them. If the fans actually had power over Gooseworks' storytelling, trust me, we would see evidence of it later. Now, I think episode 5's drastic change in character and theme actually comes from Gooseworks themselves. My theory is that as Gooseworks was structuring out the story for the Amazing Digital Circus, they got to Jax's character and backstory and were genuinely fascinated by what his story meant to them. It's no secret that Jax is very likely Gooseworks' favorite character. When you look back at the finale, it is super obvious that Gooseworks really wanted to tell Jax's story. So much so that Jax takes up nearly half of the finale. Now, like I said before, in and of itself, Gooseworks' favoritism is not a bad thing. But in going through the themes and character changes of the series, I think it is really obvious that Jax, intentionally or not on Gooseworks' part, hijacked the story of the Amazing Digital Circus. I mentioned earlier that Gooseworks made certain promises about the story of the Amazing Digital Circus both inside and outside of the series itself. Well, if you didn't know, a little after episode 2 aired, Gooseworks made a post outlining what the rest of the series was going to look like. They mentioned that each episode was going to focus on a different character, with the last 3 episodes acting as the big finale of the overall story. Well, you can start to see a problem right about here. Gooseworks promised that episode 5 was going to be Ragatha's episode. While yes, episode 5 does give us some insights into her backstory, episode 5 does not belong to Ragatha in the same way that episode 4 belongs to Gangle, or even how episode 6 belongs to Jax. Ragatha does play a major part in episode 5, but Jax is just as big of a player as she is, and in many scenes has far more screen time and memorable moments compared to Ragatha. Now, this is not an issue with the episode itself, but it is a very big problem for the promise that Gooseworks made to the fans of the show. This promise was not paid off. It got hijacked by Jax. Okay, so this is not in the script because I just found this after I already wrote and recorded the entire script, but this absolute mad lad, Azul Chrome, did the work. He counted all of the lines that every character had in the Amazing Digital Circus, and his discovery is actually pretty insane. As you probably suspected, Jax had the most lines out of any other character at 476, having almost 70 lines more than Pomni at 409. And of course, then Kane is 291, Ragatha is 259, Zubul is 249, Kinger is 210, Gangle is 139. That's pretty rough for Gangle. But what is really interesting to me about this is that Jax kind of has a mediocre amount of lines for the first 4 episodes, as you could probably guess. Other characters have most amount of lines, like Kinger in his episode 3, Gangle in episode 4. But then at what was supposedly Ragatha's episode 5, Ragatha only has 40 lines while Jax has 81. Jax literally has twice as many lines as Ragatha, which very clearly breaks the promise that was supposed to be Ragatha's episode. But additionally to that, Jax continually has the most amount of lines compared to everyone else for episodes 5, 6, 7, and 9. 9 makes a lot of sense because he was a really, really big player in that one. And episode 6, that was, of course, his episode. But I think this just really shows that there was a huge shift at episode 5. Jax has a lot of lines through episodes 1 through 4, but it was kind of average amount of lines. But then all of a sudden, Gooseworks really changed up the promise on episode 5 and made Jax a much bigger player. If Jax had the most or very close to the most amount of lines for episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4, and he was very clearly meant to be like a main character or the main character throughout the story, then this whole discussion about like Jax having so many more lines than everyone else wouldn't even be a discussion, because everybody would be like, yeah, of course Jax is the main character of the story, like it's him and Pomni, of course the two of them would have way more lines than everyone else, obviously. But seeing as Gooseworks made different promises earlier on in the series, that's not the conversation that's being had. Thank you, Azul Chrome, for making this and spending so much time on who had the most amount of lines, because this is insane. Additionally, the theme Gooseworks was working on also got hijacked by Jax. A couple of years ago, a fan asked Gooseworks essentially what one of the major themes was of the Amazing Digital Circus. Gooseworks responded that there is meaning in a stagnant life. Now, that theme is certainly present, but I think the new focus on Jax's character really changed up what the main theme was for the series. Instead of the story really paying off this idea in the final episode, we get about 10 to 15 minutes of that stagnant life theme being explored, mostly in a montage, and then the story of Jax's complex trauma leading to a very complex individual who chose not to fully accept the help he was receiving, and then we get Kane coming back from the dead and maybe reliving some past experiences before we go right back to our theme of stagnation still holding meaning. That is some pretty intense thematic whiplash, and if you remember the lesson I learned from looking into the thematic idea of passengers in the last video, you'll know that an unfocused theme does not make for a stronger narrative. The story of the Amazing Digital Circus is actually made weaker because of the unfocused storytelling pulled between the original promised ideas and the new promises Gooseworks made halfway through the series. So now what? What do we do with this information? Well, if you are new to the channel, I have a tendency to rewrite movies to hopefully better match with a cohesive thematic vision. It stretches my writing muscles, and you guys seem to really like it. When it comes to the Amazing Digital Circus, I honestly don't think that much needs to be changed. All we need to do is promise earlier on that the story will be about Jax and Pomni, the most unlikely duo to ever exist, but one that leads to the most healing for the individual that has been silently suffering for years. Let's dive in. We'll just do the first 4 episodes so that this rewrite doesn't take another hour. I did really want to rewrite a bunch of details from the story, especially later on, but that would take way too long, and my future editing self is already trembling in fear at the length of this 6-page script. Episode 1, I think, can be kept basically the same. Jax has a lot of screen time by himself, and Pomni gets us moving on the main plot with C&A. Then in episode 2, Jax accidentally ends up beneath the map with Pomni and Gummy Goo. This action forces Pomni and Jax, who so far haven't really gotten along, into close proximity. Pomni shows a lot of empathy to Gummy Goo, while Jax doesn't really care because Gummy Goo is an NPC and doesn't exist. This shows a huge empathetic divide between the two characters, but they do work together to solve their big problem. Episode 3 is honestly the trickiest. I do think Jax should somehow end up in the scary door with Kinger and Pomni, but doing so would have to change up how the episode plays out. Now for Jax, Kinger, and Pomni, as funny as it would be for the horror to really get under Jax's skin, I don't think it would. Having a dynamic where Pomni is consistently terrified, Kinger is doing his best to solve the problems while being a little crazy, and Jax is just being loud and annoying and having a ton of fun with the whole situation, I think would be enough to warrant the trio in getting stuck in the situation together. Then once they are all dragged into hell, Jax with his lanky bunny legs runs through the spirit fog as fast as possible. I think he could use some of his toon logic that he displays in episode 6 to avoid the spirits coming after him or something along those lines. Pomni chases after Jax and gets possessed. Then we have a whole conversation between Pomni and Kinger. After they make it back, Jax makes some comments about the two really taking their time in there together. Episode 4 is actually pretty easy. Just have Jax talk with Pomni a little bit more near the beginning of the episode while he is still trying to have fun and make chaos, then the two are given a more genuine interaction later. The first conversation could be Jax making fun of Pomni flirting with Gummy Goo, because in this rewrite the three actually spent time together, and Gangle yells at Jax to keep working the drive-thru. Then the second conversation has Jax absolutely exhausted. He mentions how none of Kane's adventures really worked him like this and how he hates getting bossed around by Gangle. Pomni then laughs and asks if Jax has ever been not loud and causing chaos. Jax grumbles a bit, but doesn't answer. Pomni then fist bumps his shoulder and says that maybe the next adventure will be more his speed. Just don't bully Gangle too hard, or else she might force him to work another shift. Then Gangle shows up, says the most annoying line ever uttered in fast food ever, and the rest of the episode follows suit. Now let's go through what these changes will mean for the rest of the series. Episode 5 now feels more natural, pairing up Jax with Pomni as friends. In the first 3 episodes, they were forced together in some way, and in episode 4, Jax goes out of his way to talk to and hang out with Pomni for a moment. Episode 6 also follows a natural build-up, with the betrayal hitting much harder, as we have actually seen these two characters be paired up and become friends over the course of 5 episodes instead of just 1. Pomni going after Jax in the finale makes much more sense, and we get the payoff for their friendship in Jax's last moment. Then maybe we could have that one image of Pomni reading to Jax as one of the last shots of the series, putting the story of Pomni and Jax to rest. Remember the Brandon Sanderson story I told at the beginning of this video? I think it takes a lot of self-awareness as a writer to recognize when you are giving favoritism to a specific side character, whether or not it is because of their personality, their design, or their journey. But if there is a side character you love because of the story they desperately need to tell, then why not make them the main character? You are the storyteller. You have full control over the promises you make within your story. If you really want to tell a certain character's story, then promise that story and explore that journey. I really love the Amazing Digital Circus. I think it's fantastic, and it has some of the most creative and inspired moments on the indie YouTube animation scene. However, it has one glaring weakness. It only told half the story it promised to tell because Gooseworks had another story they wanted to express and explore. If Jax and Pomni's story had been promised at the very beginning, we would have been able to see Gooseworks thrive in writing their favorite character from beginning to end. Side characters would have been side characters, and far fewer people would have been bothered by the direction of the story because they knew what they were signing up for. Pomni and Jax and their adventure in the Amazing Digital Circus. Unfortunately, taking a look back through the series, it feels like Gooseworks felt they had to get through all of the other storylines and plot points before diving into the narrative they really wanted to explore. The lesson here: if you have a favorite character, if you have a story you desperately need to tell, then tell that story. Promise that arc and make the art you always wanted to make. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this analysis and rewrite of the Amazing Digital Circus. I have a really cool board game story that I really want to share with you guys. It is on my second channel, Chapter 1 Games, and I really hope you enjoy that. Please check that out, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!